Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
Hello, Beat Check listeners. I'm Gosia Wozniacka, and I'm the environmental justice reporter at the Oregonian. Today, I'm with Julia Silverman, our education reporter. We're going to talk about what climate change means to schools and other back-to-school stories since we're in September. So let's get started. Welcome to the show, Julia. Thanks for taking the time to speak with me.
Thanks for having me, Gosia. I know we're both parents, and I know we have both greeted the start of the school year with a mix of joy and maybe a little bit of apprehension, too.
Yes, a little bit of anxiety somewhere mixed in there. So I have a first grader, so it's especially fun going to a new school this year.
That is way more fun than my crabby 15-year-olds.
So Julia, it's September. Kids are going back to school. I'm sure lots of people listening have kiddos going back. And we just had a spate of really hot temperatures, something that we, didn't typically see in the past. But now we've got, September being really hot, smoky. We had terrible air quality for a few days. We, this past weekend, we kind of had to stay inside a lot. And this is becoming kind of a pattern the last few years. Summer seems to be shifting by about a month. When kids go back to school in September, they're faced with these hot temperatures or terrible air quality because the wildfires are still out there. How are schools being impacted by this? Why is this a problem for schools in general that we're having this sort of untypical September more often now?
This is such a great question. I think for a long time, schools in Oregon were able to get away with not really having to think very much about climate control in their schools. There might have been like an off day in June or maybe a day in September when it was hot and sticky and uncomfortable in the building. But in general, it wasn't a pressing and present enough problem to rise to the top of all the other giant lists of problems that schools and the folks who work there are trying to solve day in and day out, right? We have seen a huge shift in that as the climate has changed and warmed. And I feel like we are getting to a tipping point where schools can no longer ignore this. Remember that most, not all, but most schools in Oregon actually begin in August because school district administrators and officials are trying to give particularly high school students as much time in school as possible before they face things like AP exams and big tests in the spring. So most of the time kids go back in August. And when I think about this, I think that we can have extreme hot weather in August, in September, in May on the other end, and in June. Now, once that starts sort of spilling over until April and October, we're toast and it's time to move to Saskatchewan, right? But schools really can't ignore this issue anymore. So
yeah, and I should add too, and it's not just a summer thing because now we're seeing these extreme winter storms, ice storms that are closing schools, and so schools have to deal with that as well.
Right, and an ice storm is more of a transportation problem in many ways than it is a school district problem. Obviously, school districts, and for that matter, government officials cannot control the weather, but they and school districts don't necessarily have any direct control over how quickly the roads get cleared in the winter. And remember that even if you or I can walk our kiddos to school and, put on our yak tracks or just step really carefully, Does everybody know what yak tracks are? They're those shoes with, there's those like spike things that you attach to your shoes. Staff of a particular school might come from all over the place. So if you have a school in inner Northeast Portland, but your teacher's driving in from Estacada, that teacher is kind of at the mercy of the conditions of the road. But what I will say is that really what we're dancing around here is the question of deferred maintenance, right? And we really saw that last winter when, after the terrible ice storm last January, there were several schools in the Portland Public School District that simply were not able to reopen after the roads were clear again because pipes had burst and there was flooding everywhere. And, in one case, there's a school in Southwest Portland that I think about a lot that still isn't open. That's Markham Elementary. All of their students are now being housed in a wing of Jackson Middle School. The district says their school that had needed enormous amounts of rehabilitation after last January's storm will finally be open again after winter break. So yes, we're seeing this on both ends. So I use the phrase deferred maintenance. And this is the cost of repairing, maintaining and repairing all of the systems that keep schools working, boilers and HVAC systems and, the roof, that just like any homeowner, when those things are working, it's kind of easy to forget almost that you have to maintain them. I am not suggesting that school districts are forgetting about them. I am saying that there are so many priorities and only a limited pot of money. And if you're like, well, the water heater seems to be holding on, even though I know it's really reaching the end of its life, so I'm going to spend that money on something else instead that is a more pressing issue. And then maintenance just builds up and builds up.
And many homeowners do that too. So it's just a school district impacts hundreds of kiddos.
Exactly. I just told my husband we have to hire somebody to clean the chimneys because I thought maybe there might be squirrels in them. So probably I should have done that 2 years ago, but I don't know. I wasn't worried about it.
Yeah. So school districts need to upgrade basically because of these weather events, extreme weather events, whether be it heat, wildfire, ice storm, that are becoming basically more frequent in Oregon, and making those improvements or upgrades or replacements of their systems a necessity, essentially. And you and I just wrote about schools looking to fund new HVAC systems in the Portland area because the old ones can't keep up because of this extreme weather. Can you tell me more about what the needs are of these schools, where they're trying to get the money from?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I thought a lot about last week was the issue of equity, right? And there was a very clear pattern that emerged over the week of who was able to stay in school uninterrupted and who was not. And for example, many of the schools in Washington County are newer and have been built more recently and have been modernized and upgraded more recently. Part of that has to do with taxpayers being more willing to support bonds there, and part of that just has to do with the fact that as their population has grown more recently, they've built more recently, as opposed to in Portland where you've got a whole bunch of schools from like the 1920s. These old brick buildings, beautiful, but aging. So it was very stark, the contrast between the haves and the have-nots, right? And let's think carefully about what it means when school is canceled on the dime. I mean, you've got a 6-year-old, he's 6.
Yep.
So, that like, if all of a sudden your kid's not in school, your entire workday is shifted. Right. Many people are not lucky enough to have a grandparent, within reach who can immediately provide care or help fill in. So then you have to take a day off of work. There are genuine economic impacts to this that are a real and unstated cost to kids being out of school. So you and I wrote a story about this and noted that one way that at least Multnomah County school districts are, and specifically the districts that are within Portland city limits, which is not just Portland, that also includes portions of the David Douglas, Reynolds, Park Rose, and Centennial school districts. One source that they're looking to is the Portland Clean Energy Fund. And I honestly, you probably know way more about PCEF. Do we call it PCEF or PCEF?
PCEF, yeah.
PCEF than I do, for sure. But this is the city's fund that is used to support climate justice actions. And those school districts have banded together along with the Multnomah Education Service District to argue that the initial round of funding that they were given for climate upgrades in their schools, which worked out to about $50 million, should be followed up by a second round, anywhere between $46 to $100 million, which they plan to use for climate upgrades in their schools.
That's right. Yeah. And the Portland Clean Energy Fund, for those who don't know, is basically funded by a 1% tax on large retailers in our city. And it's been pretty flush with money. So a lot of different parties have been trying to get a piece of that pie. But as you mentioned, the school's ask is pretty legitimate and obviously would have impact on a lot of kiddos and equity issues and climate and emissions. So it's within the scope of what the Portland Clean Energy Fund is meant to fund.
And Gosha, remind me, when do we find out whether that's granted?
So the school districts have been asked to submit a full application this fall, and they should find out sometime, I believe, end of winter, early spring, whether they got the money.
Right. And, when we were writing about this last week and when I was talking to parents, one of the things I heard from people was like, well, wait a minute, weren't we supposed to get all this money? What's happening with it? And the answer to that is these things do, I guess they take a little bit of time. And I'm a little bit out of my element here in talking about like HVAC contractors and that kind of stuff. But, it's in progress. Like there are 4 more schools within PPS that will come online with air conditioning in the spring, and more that are coming. But I guess just getting the money sort of starts the process. It doesn't finish it.
Right. Takes a while to do those repairs. Well, one thing I was curious about, I'm not an education reporter, and, PCEF, the Portland Clean Energy Fund, is a very unique fund to Oregon. So districts in other parts of Oregon or in other states in the U.S. don't really have access to a fund like PCEF. So how are schools in general in other parts of the country dealing with climate change and this necessity to upgrade their facilities? Because it's not really just Oregon. I mean, schools everywhere don't have AC, have, old heating systems, crappy ventilation that they need to swap and change and upgrade. So what are the options?
It depends on where you live. Like, I do think it's probably, I'm not an education reporter in the South, but I do think it's probably safe to say that most schools in the South and Southwest probably are much more likely than schools in the Pacific Northwest to have been equipped with climate control, just because like they've needed it for so much longer than we have. And it certainly is true that like if your classroom is 85 or 90 degrees, it's difficult to keep kids, especially little kids, focus and attention if everybody is just hot and sticky and uncomfortable and sweaty. So, but you're asking a great question. And I just wrote right before the heat wave hit in Portland, I wrote a story about the Oregon's mechanism for funding school facilities. And essentially, it's very much on local voters and their willingness to approve a bond. And it holds a lot of promise for school districts, but also a lot of peril. So let's take Estacada again as an example, because I visited that school district for that story. Last May, Estacada asked voters to approve a $149 million bond. And boy, Their high school in particular, which I toured, is just, it is not looking great. There are, there's problems with the pipes. There's just, the facilities are not modernized. There's no, like in the wood shop, there aren't like electrical outlets. There's an ancient heating system. Like it's kind of like held together a little bit by chewing gum, right? Despite like their very real and best efforts to work really hard to keep things up and running for students. Mm-hmm. So they asked voters to approve this $149 million bond. Their idea was they would build a new high school and a new CTE center, move the middle schoolers into the old high school's wing, which would get some rehab, and then also use a former middle school for an elementary school because they're actually a growing district. And so they had all these plans, and voters turned them down flat. So
and was this the first time that they turned them down?
No, it certainly wasn't. In fact, voters in Estacada have not approved a bond since 2000. And I talked to them at the very end of the reporting for that story. I asked, well, are you guys going to try again in November with maybe a more tightly focused bond that's really tailored to just your biggest trouble spots? Because I had gotten some letters from readers who were like, maybe I would have considered voting for this, but they were asking for the moon. It's just too much. And the answer came back, no. The district's internal polling showed that voters simply were not in a place where they were willing or felt financially able, right? Because it is a burden. I mean, I pay my property taxes, and I'm not going to say that I'm not like, oh my God, I'm paying how much, right?
And Estacada is a rural district, so.
Sure, exactly. And we're asking a lot. So even in November, when turnout is expected to be higher because of the presidential election, they didn't feel like they would get enough support to go back out. So now what, right? And now Oregon as a state does not offer, Oregon offers matching grants for districts that have facilities needs. But in order to get a matching grant, you need to have passed a bond. So it's like a little bit of a catch-22 there, right? So districts can draw down, usually it's somewhere between about $4 and on the outer edge, $12 million from the state. But they have to get their local voters to agree to pass a bond. There is right now, the Oregon Department of Education is embarking on, and I don't know that the state has ever done anything like this before, but they've got a $5 million federal grant to do a building by building, district by district examination of every single school in the state. It's called the SASE grant. Please don't ask me what the acronym stands for. And at the end of that, they are going to have better data than we've ever had before about exactly the condition of school buildings around the state, exactly what's wrong, and exactly, I hope, how much it might cost to fix. Yeah. And they're going to, in the name of transparency, I'm told that there will, by 2027 or so, be a dashboard that lays all that out so people can compare and contrast and see for themselves. And maybe that will shape future decisions at the statewide or legislative level as we look at, boy, here is a place where there is real need and the voters simply don't feel able to get there on their own, the local voters. Now, a bond is not the only solution because, as you live in Portland, you know that here in Portland, voters are almost, always, not always, but almost always predisposed to pass a bond for schools. But that money, the bond ask that the district typically makes, is not enough to cover all of the deferred maintenance. The bonds that have been passed in Portland in recent years have tended to go toward replacing or refurbishing the city's high schools. It makes sense. They house the most students, and they're able to be like emergency shelters in the case of an earthquake or whatever. So we've been going through them. Benson High School just opened this year, and it's brand new. It looks beautiful. Next up is Jefferson, Cleveland, and Wells. Those are the last three. But the bulk of the bond ask that Portland goes for is dedicated to that. It has been money built in for deferred maintenance, but it's not the amount of money that would be needed to really like fix everything all at once.
Right. Yeah, that would be probably a massive amount.
Right. And even the most generous taxpayers might be like, you want me to pay what now?
Right.
What's happening?
Yeah, yeah. I think, yeah, it's interesting. What you mentioned, the SASE grant. Hopefully that will make these problems harder to ignore once the state,
Exactly.
knows exactly which school is in what trouble and what needs to be upgraded.
Yay,
But also
sunshine.
maybe it will, lead to a change in how things are funded. Who knows? As these climate impacts become more apparent. So.
I think transparency in data is only a good thing. And I actually asked Governor Kotek about this at a press conference last week. And, she is I think her administration is very data driven. And she indicated that she understood that this was an issue, and she didn't commit to anything. She said, we're going to continue to support my office, my budget that I'll propose will continue to support the matching grants. But I do feel like, particularly as we're seeing warming and also, winter weather, this is something that's just going to get higher and higher on the radar screen.
Well, we've been talking about HVAC systems, and that's certainly a really big necessity in the era of climate change. But there are also other challenges and needs that schools have as the climate changes. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What else besides HVACs?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to Portland again, if that's okay, because PPS actually is a leader in climate justice, and not just, I think, in Oregon, but nationally. They passed a few years back a climate justice and sustainable practices policy that has, gone further than a lot of other school districts around the country. They've committed to trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and there is a move toward green schoolyards, pulling out pavement and replacing it with natural materials. There's a movement toward electric school buses, which is supported often by federal grants. Beaverton is actually a leader on that. And there's also just I think one of the most exciting things, and I know you've done coverage of some of these students in the past, is student-led climate justice movements really pushing for change in their schools, whether that is
Yes.
less food waste or climate justice curriculum, which is really important because kids need to understand and learn about how that impacts everything else in the country. I did a story last year out at Lake Oswego, and I went to an English class where they were reading, oh my gosh, I can't remember the book, but we'll find it and we'll link it in the show notes. They were reading a book that was a fiction book that was specifically about climate change. It was allegorical, and using English as a way to get into these issues. So the idea of weaving climate justice through other parts of the curriculum is also something you see in Oregon school districts.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and looking into the future, obviously, the way that we work and our jobs will change significantly in the future. So, just preparing those kids for a different world and the types of careers that they might encounter in the future, 10, 20 years from now, they'll be pretty different. So I think the curriculum change is key. One thing that occurs to me is that we've got, as you mentioned, the Portland School District is a leader in this arena. They've got a climate policy. They've got all these changes that they're trying to make. But we've got many schools in districts in rural Oregon that are not, don't have the funding, don't have the resources, are not really passing these climate policies. And I'm wondering, how can these issues of climate change be addressed in more rural districts, especially as in some of those districts, mentioning the phrase climate change kind of shuts down the discussion. What can be sort of the approach there?
That's such an interesting question. I for that same story, the one that I did out in Lake Oswego, which was connected to a bill that did not pass the Oregon legislature in 2023, but that I expect will resurface in 2025. I talked to a coalition of teachers and students from around the state that are passionate about integrating climate justice, across a curriculum and at every grade level. And one of the members of the group that's been really pushing this was from Bend. And I remember him talking a lot about it making this accessible to people based on where they live. So, for example, if you are in a rural farming community, you can use hands-on applications about like, hey, what is changed in your farm in terms of irrigation? What has changed in your farm in terms of yield? What has changed? What do you need to know to manage your farm in a world where there might be a freak heat wave in April or there might be an ice storm in November? And I think that is a really smart way to bring climate justice home, because no matter who you are and no matter where you live, climate change is going to impact your life. But it's certainly true to say it means something very different if you're out in John Day or if you're out in Burns than if you live in Portland.
That's right. And actually, I am working on a series about the clean energy projects that are going up all around our state. And most of those clean energy projects, solar, wind farms are going in rural areas. And so it's, the kids who live in rural areas who go to school there who will inherit these projects. And, those are projects that are drastically changing the landscape. They are a source of money for rural communities. And they're also, there's carbon sequestration on farms and ranches that people in rural areas can use to help with climate change. So there's, as you mentioned, very place-specific issues that people in Portland just don't get or don't understand or don't need to really understand, maybe even because it's not their reality. And so, yeah, it sounds like addressing that, the place-based issues and, future jobs, green jobs in the specific areas is something that might be a good approach for
Absolutely.
communities. So as we've seen with the climate change, extreme weather that we mentioned, we've got school closures both in the summer and in the winter. That's a really big disruption for students. And, we had the pandemic that was kind of a proof of what happens when student learning is disrupted for longer periods. Many of Oregon's students are still very far behind in the wake of the pandemic, and you just wrote about that. Can we briefly just talk about why it takes so long to rebound, after disruption, and why students in Oregon are still behind?
Oh gosh, and now you are singing my song, because this is what keeps me up at night. So at the end of this month, September 26th to be exact, the Oregon Department of Education will release the latest round of standardized testing results, showing how kids are doing on math and reading from the previous school year. And always the disclaimer is standardized testing is imperfect. It is one measure of how kids are doing. It is not the only measure. Schools are much more than a standardized test. And we need data and a yardstick to be able to tell us, here is where kids are comparatively, so we know where to target resources, right? And we know who really needs help. I don't know what those test results are going to show. I'm nervous about it because, unlike almost everywhere else in the country, Oregon students in the aggregate have yet to show significant rebound in academic performances back to the pre-pandemic level. And I just don't know how many parents are really aware of that. I think that there is grade inflation on some level. And it is kind of easy to get lulled into a false sense of security about how your kids are doing. And I think teachers have had to adapt to the emotional toll that the pandemic took on so many kids. You see more social anxiety. You see a lot of dependence on devices. And, I think that probably leads to them, teachers as a whole in the aggregate, wanting to give kids a little bit of space as they readjust to being part of a school community. But there's nowhere to hide on a standardized test. You either know the math or you don't. You can either interpret the paragraph or you can't. And I don't know how many parents look closely at these results. And I don't know that I sense the level of urgency and alarm about our student performance in Oregon that I want to see and that I would have imagined. It sometimes sort of feels like these test results come out and there are some press conferences and everybody is like, this is terrible. We must do better. We are sending data teams to help analyze the results. And then we don't talk about it again until next year.
Right. Yep.
And I worry. And to connect this back to our conversation about climate change, Gosha, when schools close, I think it helps feed this perception that it is not crucial for kids to be at school. Mm-hmm. Now, look, I said, and I meant, it is very hard to learn when your classroom is 90 degrees, right? And I don't know why every single school isn't bringing in portable air conditioners and ice and, doing everything they can. I think many schools did try to cool their buildings last week, but it's tough with these aging buildings. Closing should be a last resort, because we already know that Oregon has a chronic absenteeism problem that's really, really significant. It's one, again, statistically, we aren't showing a rebound. We are not where you would want to be. Chronic absenteeism means that a student has missed roughly 3 weeks or more of the school year.
Yeah. And that's because of
really
the pandemic.
Yes. And I think because, it's so complicated. There's so many complicating factors leading to chronic absenteeism. But I think one of them is that people are still not quite sure when it's okay to send their kid back to school or when to stay home.
Mm-hmm. And they're sick.
Right. And schools are trying. The message has shifted on this. If you read that giant packet of stuff.
Yes, I did. It said if your kid has a little cold, send them to school.
Exactly.
That was the message on my paper.
Correct. And please, if there are any parents out there listening to this, follow that advice. Do not keep your kid home if they have a sniffle. Don't keep them home if they have lice. Honestly, I know it's gross. Oh my God, I say lice and my head starts itching. Very upsetting. But send your kid to school, because if they're not in school, they can't learn. And Oregon kids need to be learning.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly why I brought this whole thing up, is because, climate change, warming weather, extreme weather, be it in the summer or in the winter, is disrupting our schools. And, even in the winter, when it's a transportation problem, schools could function, but kids can't get there. Kids can't get to school, and so they can't learn. And schools are just not really ready, set up to do online learning. It didn't really work, this experiment in Oregon. And so I think, I do hope that school districts are contemplating this future of more disruptions, and which is why, upgrading HVAC systems is crucial, because we want those kids to be able to go to school, even when it's 100 degrees outside. Because they need to be there. Otherwise, we're going to be, sending kids home multiple times every summer and every fall, which is just unacceptable and is going to make these, standardized test results, but also just kiddos desire to be in school, it's just going to throw it out the window.
Right. You get out of the habit.
Exactly.
I just think you're absolutely right. So Oregon is at a crossroads, and I know there are a lot of problems in our state. And I think mainly about the education ones. And I'm like, why isn't everyone's hair on fire about this thing? And that's kind of short-sighted of me, because it's all interconnected, right? Like, we have a housing problem, and when families have a safe place to live, then it becomes much more possible for them to send their kids to school and be in that routine. Yep. I know that it's all connected. And I would like to see more urgency and focus on the issues that we raised in our story.
I completely agree. Julia, this has been a really important conversation. Thank you. We'll be following this topic in the future stories in Oregonian and OregonLive.com. And I'm going to drop several links to your stories and our stories in the show notes, so folks can read more. Thank you so much for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. If you like this show, give us a 5-star rating and review in Apple Podcasts. It helps people find the show. The best way to support our journalism and stories like this one is with a subscription to Oregon Live. You can do that at OregonLive.com/pod support. Until next time, thank you.